The past 12 hours have witnessed developments so critical that they could change the course of the war. On one hand, missiles continue to be launched. On the other hand, it is claimed that negotiations are taking place behind closed doors. But how can these two realities coexist at the same time? Let's begin. The latest statements from Washington indicate that a new turn has occurred in the course of the war. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, announced that contacts with Iran have been established, and that talks have begun with the right people. He even hinted that there is a plan on the table, but the reality on the ground does not align with this statement, because at the same time, the Pentagon is preparing to send thousands of new soldiers to the Middle East. It is said that, in particular, troops capable of rapid deployment could be mobilized, namely units of the 82nd Airborne Division. A statement from the Wall Street Journal reports that the U.S. Department of Defense will order the deployment of 3,000 soldiers from the 82nd Airborne Division to the Middle East to support the Iran war in the coming hours. Do you know what this means? It means that on one hand, the U.S. says peace is negotiable, while on the other, it is preparing for the war to escalate further. Diplomacy and escalation are advancing simultaneously, and the situation on the Iranian front is even harsher. Tehran's administration has shown no signs of backing down in its statements over the past few hours. On the contrary, it has taken a stance that makes negotiations difficult. And immediately afterward, new missile attacks occurred. Iran once again launched a salvo toward Israel. Air defense systems went into action. The sky lit up once more. In other words, let's be clear. There is no ceasefire, no slowdown. The war continues at full intensity, but the most critical front at the moment is the narrow Strait of Hormuz. In the past 12 hours, a very important message came from Iran. Tehran stated that it could allow the passage of non-hostile ships. At first glance, this seems like a retreat, but the reality is very different because at the same time, global data shows this. The flow of oil and LNG passing through Hormuz is almost halted. That is, Iran may be allowing passage, but no one dares to cross this risky corridor, revealing the most dangerous effect of the war, the energy shock. According to the latest analyses, this crisis affects the natural gas market more than oil prices. In particular, the pressure on LNG lines coming from Qatar poses a much greater threat to Europe and Asia. Markets are volatile, investors are cautious. No one knows where this war will go. And the most striking part is this. World leaders are now openly worried. The Pope said that the war is getting worse. International circles believe that a process of losing control has begun, because now this war is no longer just military. This war has become a multifaceted conflict that targets energy lines, global trade, diplomatic balances, and even the internal stability of states. And all of this situation can be summed up in one sentence. Talks may begin, but the war has not ended. Perhaps it is now entering its most dangerous phase. At the same time, in news coming from Europe, it is observed that the Iranian regime is in serious trouble. Let's discuss these details down to the smallest detail. The raising of the lion and sun flag, a symbol of Iranian authority, at the shameful embassy of the Islamic Republic in Copenhagen, Denmark, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Japan announced their preparations to ensure safe passage through the strait. The Strait of Hormuz, Iran's greatest negotiation base, has become a noose around its own neck. Iran closed the strait, and exactly 400 massive cargo ships were stranded off the coast of Oman. In just a few days, global oil prices skyrocketed. Europe's energy lines were cut, and the economies of the world's powers were pushed to the limit. However, Tehran's strategic gamble failed. 22 major countries signed an unprecedented joint military declaration to put an end to this chaos in the energy markets. They decided to deploy warships, mine-clearing fleets, and air patrols directly in the Strait of Hormuz. This move fundamentally changes the nature of the war. So how did things suddenly reach this point? Previously, NATO had flatly refused to participate in this war. A group of 22 countries, Mostly NATO members, but also Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the UAE, and Bahrain are joining forces to ensure the freedom of the Strait of Hormuz, which will be reopened as soon as possible. The U.S. was trying to carry out this large operation largely on its own, with only limited support from Israel and the Gulf. That is, until Iran made that fatal mistake. According to Reuters, Iran attacked the gigantic LN Lafan Wars plant. Bloomberg reported that the damage reached a staggering $20 billion. In Europe, natural gas prices skyrocketed 35% overnight. Japan's crude oil imports have practically come to a halt, and suddenly, countries that said, "This is not our war," bitterly realized that what was really burning was their own pocketbook. When the calendar marked March 19th, the panic button had already been pressed in the capitals of Europe and Asia. The United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Japan issued a joint statement. Simultaneously, they condemned Iran's attacks. They announced that measures would be taken to stabilize energy markets, and that they are willing to contribute to appropriate efforts to ensure safe passage through the straits. That same day, this declaration expanded and turned into a massive global military coalition. In total, 22 countries, led by the U.S., signed an agreement for a joint military operation. This hybrid force structure, composed of 22 countries, decided to deploy naval assets, submarine defense systems, and autonomous vehicles directly in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. However, the true driving force behind this immense coalition was the relentless pressure from Washington. President Donald Trump crossed the limits of diplomacy by receiving Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi in the Oval Office. Trump, who requested direct military support from Japan, which depends 90% on Gulf oil, brought up the most traumatic event of World War II. Who better than Japan to know about surprises? Didn't I tell you about Pearl Harbor? Yes. No. Trump's direct reference to Pearl Harbor as an example of defense against surprise. Attacks left the Japanese delegation in shock. This was a clear message to the Allies. They no longer have the luxury of staying on the sidelines. You will deploy your fleets in the Strait of Hormuz. So, how exactly will this massive coalition of 22 nations, formed behind closed doors, carry out operations in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz? The plan consists of 4 distinct phases. The first phase is mine clearance. The coalition will initiate a thorough operation using mine-clearing ships, unmanned submarines, and specially equipped helicopters. With support from the United Kingdom and Japan, this operation will take weeks, perhaps months, but just its initiation will already relieve the markets. The second phase is tanker escort. This is the modern version of Operation Earnest, Will of 1987. The naval forces of 22 countries will take on the patrolling mission. This step will distribute the burden, currently on the shoulders of the United States, and effectively ensure safe passage through the strait. The third phase is aerial patrol and coastal surveillance. A network of air surveillance will be established to monitor Iran's coastal missiles, drone launch areas, and fast boat movements. This multi-level surveillance network, created with the addition of elements from the U.S., Australia, Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, and Qatar, will make Iran's hit-and-run tactics almost impossible, as every move will be detected in real time. The fourth phase is the systematic destruction of Iran's coastal attack capabilities. Coalition air forces, in coordination with U.S. aircraft carriers, will begin targeting missile batteries, drone bases, and Iran's fast boat shelters deployed along the coast. This means clearing the strait not only of mines, but also of Iran's attack capabilities. Additionally, this encirclement is tightening. A third U.S. aircraft carrier is on the way. 2,500 Marines are being deployed to the region, and even a ground operation aimed at the island of Keshem is on the table. To all this, the situation also has an economic aspect. The International Energy Agency released 400 million barrels of oil reserves. Coalition countries are asking oil producers to increase production. Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline is already operating at full capacity. The goal is to bring oil prices below $100, and completely frustrate Iran's strategy of creating a global energy crisis. By the time this international fleet reaches the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's much-praised asymmetric maritime doctrine will completely collapse. The Revolutionary Guard Navy is trapped in its own waters for Tehran, which has seen its mining capability reduced by 90% by the United States, and lost more than 130 ships at sea. This coalition represents a definitive military collapse. Iranian commanders issued threats, saying they would sink every enemy ship. However, this threat is quickly fading and becoming insignificant in the face of the impenetrable aerial umbrella and destroyer shields, equipped with Aegis combat systems, established jointly by 22 countries. The multinational military force, which has effectively lifted the blockade over the strait, permanently invalidates Tehran's tactic of choking the flow of oil to global actors. The military blockade, in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, is only the visible face of the crisis. The true destruction awaiting Iran is an irreversible isolation process advancing silently through diplomatic channels and global financial networks. Iran's delegitimization campaign, led by Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar, has begun to bear fruit. Following the European Parliament, the Balkans, and many European countries have officially recognized Iran's Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. The total number suddenly exceeded 33. This move is not just a diplomatic condemnation, but also the total dismantling of the remaining financial networks, shell companies, and logistical channels of the Revolutionary Guards in Europe and the Balkans. The freezing of bank accounts, cancellation of business visas, and immediate detention of suspicious cargo transfers will severely weaken the IRGC's ability to carry out operations abroad, since the gray areas and intermediary institutions previously used to circumvent sanctions are now classified as part of international terrorism financing. The risk of doing business with Iran has become unacceptable for global companies. By closing the strait and effectively eliminating oil revenues, Tehran has lost not only this diplomatic blow, but also alternative channels for cash flow. This external financial and diplomatic strangulation is inevitably causing severe chaos on the domestic front. The contract between the state, which promised welfare, security, and stability, and the people has collapsed before the eyes of millions. In metropolitan areas, where access to basic food and drinking water is becoming increasingly difficult, the economic crisis is driving civil unrest in the streets to an uncontrollable point. The regime's strategy of numbing the masses with tales of external enemies is suffering a severe defeat against the real hunger and poverty experienced in people's kitchens. The higher echelons of the bureaucracy and the military elite, anticipating the imminent collapse, are attempting to flee the country with their capital, revealing the magnitude of internal corruption. In the geopolitical chessboard, from a broader perspective, Iran's enormous miscalculation in its strategies comes to light. Global allies of the regime, from whom it expected unconditional support in times of crisis, have fallen into profound and meaningful silence. Major players like China and Russia are showing total diplomatic and military paralysis in the face of the enormous naval forces of the 22 countries gathered in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. Beijing, which imports most of its crude oil directly from Iranian ports, does not dare to directly challenge this iron encirclement created by the United States and its allies. Chinese-flagged tankers attempt to pass through the dark waters of the Bosphorus via complex and temporary routes. However, decision-makers in Beijing avoid the enormous costs that would arise from entering into a direct conflict with a large coalition. However, Moscow's dynamics point to a very different dead end. Russia, although benefiting economically from the high oil prices caused by the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, has seen its strategic maneuvering capacity severely restricted. The Kremlin, while trying to keep its economy afloat under harsh Western sanctions, sees these price increases as a lifeline. However, Moscow is in a difficult situation in Ukraine. While the tough war continues, Russia does not have the capacity to provide maritime or aerial protection to Iran in the Gulf. The support Russia can offer is far from changing the situation on the ground. It is limited to a restricted behind-the-scenes satellite intelligence exchange. On the front of traditional allies, such as the Syrian regime and North Korea, deep silence reigns in the face of pressure from the modern fleets gathered in the Gulf waters. Iran's much-praised resistance axis narrative quickly collapsed when faced with the reality of armed conflict. Furthermore, major Muslim countries in the region, such as Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, have aligned with the global coalition against the chaos created by Tehran. This picture shows that the conflict is not just a tension between the U.S. and Iran, but that Iran is at war with the stability of the entire region. The world is witnessing the birth pains of a new global order in the face of Iran's silent isolation. The main conclusion that arises here is the following. When a coalition composed of 22 nations, representing a significant portion of the world's air and naval power, is at your doorstep, what military options remain? In a conventional war scenario where regular forces face each other, military analysts estimate that the survival chances of the Iranian army are practically zero. The old generation frigates and light strike vessels in the Revolutionary Guard inventory have the capacity to disappear in seconds in the vast death ring created by jets, launched from aircraft carriers and Aegis combat systems. In this desperate equation, Tehran's path is not a victory strategy, but an access denial doctrine, focused on closing the region to the enemy. They have only 3 asymmetric cards that are difficult to implement, but carry potential danger. The first option involves covert mining operations. A scenario is being evaluated in which miniature Gaidir-class submarines that leave no radar trace and vessels, resembling civilian fishing boats, are used to place smart mines in the blind spots of the strait during the night. The second option is to use the rugged coastal terrain. The plan is to carry out surprise attacks on coalition ships using NOR and C-802 anti-ship missiles fired from labyrinthine tunnels dug into the steep slopes of the Zagros Mountains, overlooking the Gulf. The third and final card is to involve regional representatives in the conflict. The Houthis in Yemen are ordered to attack trade routes in the Red Sea to divert the attention and firepower of the international fleet across the Bab el-Mandeb, the Gulf of Aden, and the Strait of Hormuz. However, none of these steps have enough weight to militarily defeat the coalition. The goal is to hit a Western tanker or a mine-clearing ship to increase insurance costs to astronomical levels. The objective is to break the coalition's political will by creating panic in the global public sphere. This approach embodies a high-risk asymmetric suicide doctrine, destined to result in less military skill and more failure. This grim strategic panorama reveals a boomerang effect of great magnitude, rarely seen in geopolitical history. The responsible parties buried the assumption that closing the gates of the Strait of Hormuz would not bend the global economy, falling into the trap they themselves had set. All diplomatic and economic bridges to the European continent have been irreversibly destroyed. Thank you for watching the military conflict. To support me, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.